Dr. Dennis Wainstock is here today. He's been here before. You remember him from the Malcolm X program? And he teaches American history at Fairmont State University, Parkersburg Community College. He is the author of several books, one about the 1968 presidential campaign. I mentioned Malcolm X, also the Korean War. He's from Salem, West Virginia. And today he's here to talk about the decision to drop the atomic bomb. Please welcome Dennis Wainstock.
Thanks, John, and the Wheeling Public Library for putting on these programs. This is wonderful, and it helps bond the library with the community and offers a community of interest for you. I wrote the decision to drop the atomic bomb in 1996. I got it in hardcover here. It's coming out in paperback, hopefully by the end of this summer, and I do have the internet, Amazon, if you want to purchase it. It's going to be much less expensive than this. You can get it for about $15, some places for about $12. And what my book is different than other books, I noticed there's so many books on the dropping of the atomic bombs. This is one of the most controversial American foreign policy decisions in our history. But my book is a little different in the sense that I present both the American and the Japanese histories in the last 5 months of the war, the last 5 or 6 months, beginning in April of 1945 and ending in August of 1945. Let's begin in April. The Emperor of Japan, Hirohito. Hirohito was more than a symbol of Japan. Hirohito, the emperor, was Japan. Japan was the emperor. Don't try to understand this intellectually. It's mystical. Hirohito told the new Prime Minister, Suzuki, in April of 1945 to get peace. This was the month of Okinawa. Some of you may have been there. Okinawa was one of the worst battles of World War II, with over 50,000 American casualties, dead and wounded, 120,000 Japanese, the same. It was only 400 miles or so from the island of Japan. Japan was 4 major islands right here off the coast of China. Okinawa over here. Now the Americans had a stepping stone right to Japan. Japanese cities had been napalmed, and a new campaign had begun by General Curtis LeMay of the U.S. Army Air Force. He had a plan to bomb using napalm sticks, which caused fiery explosions and firestorms. Beginning in April, we would bomb every major Japanese city, over 25,000. Some several times over. Tokyo, 7 times. The Japanese sent out peace feelers through the Soviet Union, which was still neutral at this time in the Far East, through Portugal, Sweden, Switzerland, neutral countries. The Japanese were willing to talk about negotiating a surrender with the United States. They had one main surrender term before they would negotiate. They must keep their Emperor Hirohito. Hirohito was pictured by the Allies, the United States, and Great Britain as a war criminal. The Japanese feared that we would imprison Hirohito, or worse, hang him. That they could not countenance. Our surrender term was unconditional. That means no condition. And imagine the Japanese asking the question, What will you do to us if we surrender? Not sane. Will you destroy our nation? Not sane. Will you kill our people? Not sane. You can imagine a Japanese asking the question, can we ask one little question? Make it short. Are you guys still pissed off about Pearl Harbor? In April of 1945, April 12th, Franklin Delano Roosevelt died. He'd been president since 1933. His vice president was Harry S. Truman, a senator from Missouri. This man right here, Truman. Harry S. Truman had not been in on the foreign policy decisions of the Roosevelt administration. Unlike today's vice presidents, Truman was out of the loop. He learned when he became president that he had this thing which was dubbed an atomic bomb. He'd been working on it for 3 years. It was almost ready. Harry Truman, who was a very good domestic politician, knew the Senate and the House, understood American politics well, had very little experience when it came to foreign affairs. He asked the State Department to draw up a modified version of unconditional surrender. Our State Department was made up of pretty bright young people. They had known, they'd come from some of the major universities of the United States, Princeton, Harvard, Yale, West Virginia University. And they knew Chinese and some knew Japanese. They understood history and economics. They went to the Library of Congress and they studied and burned the midnight oil and came back and gave Harry S. Truman what was called the Potsdam Declaration. The Potsdam Declaration was what Harry S. Truman, who went across, as he would call the Atlantic, the pond, with his Secretary of State, Jimmy Burns, for a summit conference in the defeated nation of Germany, with Winston Churchill and our ally during World War II, Stalin, Joseph Stalin of the Soviet Union. At Potsdam, Truman was to give a modified version of our unconditional surrender policy towards Japan. The State Department's original document included 3 points. First, Japan will not be destroyed as a nation. Second, Japanese people not be enslaved. Third, most important, Japan could keep Emperor Hirohito. At some point on the 7-day voyage across the pond, Harry Truman took out a pencil. And of the 3 points, he erased the third one. The final document given at Potsdam to the press. Japan will not be destroyed as a nation. Japanese people not be enslaved. Later, in Tokyo, as the new prime minister left the imperial household after an imperial cabinet meeting, the Tokyo newspapers asked him to comment on the Potsdam Declaration. He answered with one word: Mokusatsu. Mokusatsu was a Japanese term. Literally, it was translated, kill with silence. American idiom, no comment. Harry S. Truman took it as a no. Japan would not accept the Potsdam Declaration. He wrote on the top secret document in pencil, "Drop when ready, Harry S. Truman." On a small island in the South Pacific called Tinian. You may not be able to see it clearly, but it's right here. A crew led by Tibbets, right here, in an airplane, a B-29 Super Fortress, which was named after Tibbets' mother, Enola Gay, hoisted into the bomb bay, one bomb. First atomic bomb. This was 20,000 tons of TNT. It was an atomic bomb called Little Boy. Into the plane in the early morning hours, Tibbets told his crew to buckle up tight. They weren't sure exactly what kind of bomb it was at first. They asked him as the plane's engines revved up, "Is it atomic?" "Yes." "Hold on tight. Don't know if we can get up off this island." It was an island taken from the Japanese. Its runway was short. They went full throttle. The plane, full speed, started to come towards the end of the island. It still wasn't up. He gave it another thrust, and up it went. Seemed to go down for a moment. Another thrust. It was clear. On this day, at 8:14 a.m., let me read. It was a little past 8 in the morning when the plane approached its target. All crew members, save Tibbets, his co-pilot Robert Lewis, and bombardier Tom Furby, donned Polaroid goggles to protect their eyes. At 8:14 a.m., the bomb bay doors opened. A minute later, Furby shouted, "Bomb away!" He watched through the Enola Gay's plexiglass nose as the bomb seemed to stand for a moment suspended. Then began its descent. The tail gunner, Bob Karen, produced a striking account of what happened 43 seconds later. A column of smoke rising fast, a fiery red core, a bubbling mass, purple-gray in color, with that red core. It's all turbulent. Fires are springing up everywhere like flames shooting out of a huge bed of coals. Start to count the fires. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 14. It's impossible. There are too many to count. Here it comes. The mushroom shape that Captain Parsons spoke about. It's like a mass of bubbling molasses. The mushroom is spreading out. It's maybe a mile or two wide, half a mile high. It's nearly level with us and climbing. It's very black. There's a purplish tint to the cloud. The base of the mushroom looks like a heavy undercast that is shot through with flames. Hiroshima must be below there. The plane came around for a look. Hush all over the crew. The city, Hiroshima, is gone. Hiroshima killed, on blast, probably about 80,000 people. In a flick of an eye. Later, people who had survived the blast, who seemed to be well, got strange symptoms. Purplish dots, vomiting, diarrhea, and then died of radiation poisoning. Probably another 120,000. Hiroshima is gone. 2 days later, on August 8, 1945, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan. Now, the island empire alone, its allies defeated, Germany and Italy, facing the armed might of the British, the Soviets, the Americans, and the Chinese, alone, desperate. The next day, August 9, 1945. Another B-29 super fortress left the island of Tinian, this time carrying a spherical-shaped atomic bomb named Fat Man. Their original target was under clouds. Turned the plane and went to the second target on the list. Nagasaki, Japan, on the island of Kyushu. It was the seat of Christianity in the Far East. As they came over Nagasaki, the gauge on the fuel was getting low. They had to drop this bomb. They'd already lit it up. But there was cloud cover all over Nagasaki. Finally, the bombardier said, "I'll drop it by hand if I see an opening." He caught at the side of his eye a glance, an opening. Dropped it right through. It blew a mile high. It missed the center of Nagasaki, which was over here, and hit a suburb. It didn't kill as many as they thought otherwise it would. Probably as many as 80,000, counting radiation. 1, 2, 3, punch. The Japanese, really, their cities destroyed, alone. Finally, on September 14, 1945, Japan surrendered. The dropping of the atomic bomb immediately began a controversy on whether or not they were necessary to end the war. Before we get into the arguments, I should add here, although some of you probably know this very well, you may have been young at the time, some of you have been alive at the time, that America's attitude towards the Japanese would probably be described as basically blind hatred. We hated the Japanese more than we hated the Germans. There was a distinction at the time between the good German and the Nazi. There never was a distinction among the Japanese. A poll taken by Gallup in 1944 showed that 13% poll thought that the best thing to do with the Japanese was to exterminate them. Others thought that was a little bit too harsh. Maybe what we ought to do is sterilize them. Maybe dying off about now. Why do we hate the Japanese so much? Part of it was the Pearl Harbor attack, which became a symbol of the war against Japan. There was also propaganda and racism intermixed. We pictured the Japanese as apes, animal forms, often as brutes. Our advertising showed them. You can see by this caricature here, a new book out, The Japs, This the Round Eyes, which they call Westerners. In this book by John Dower, he writes, "The Army's Infantry Journal warned that the enemy was not merely a buck-toothed, nearsighted, pint-sized monkey, but a robot-like creature. In the wartime press, the Japs were invariably inhuman, likened to vermin, and most particularly to apes." A magazine concluded that the Japanese were kind of a freak survival in the modern world, and a scientist at the noted Smithsonian in Washington, D.C. said to President Roosevelt that the Japanese skulls were some 2,000 years less developed than our own. And the way they fought, Americans couldn't understand it. Japanese Marines on the islands in the South Pacific rarely surrendered. Fight to the last. I believe on one island, Tarawa, we captured 17 of the 3,000 Japanese. So crippled that they couldn't commit harakiri, Japanese suicide. In the Japanese manual given a young 18-year-old Japanese youth at the time, it was written, bear in mind, to surrender would not only shame you, but your mother and father would never be able to hold up their heads high again. Always save the last round for yourself. Moreover, they seemed not to understand the Geneva Convention and the treatment of prisoners of war. When our prisoners of war were released, many were in Manchuria, thin, scrawny, starving. However, the Japanese guards weren't in much better shape. We had a food blockade against the Japanese. And those in a food blockade would feed the prisoners of war, the enemy, probably last. In this environment, we dropped the bombs. President Harry S. Truman and his Secretary of Defense, Henry L. Stimson, later defended their action in 3 points. This became the argument for dropping the atomic bomb. The 3 points included, first, we had to drop the atomic bombs in order to avoid an invasion of the home islands of Japan. Can anyone doubt, said Stimson, what the casualty rate would have been if we would have landed in these home islands? With the horrendous casualty rates in the South Pacific. Thus, that led to the second point. The first point, to avoid an invasion of the home islands. The second point, to save American lives. And thus it led to the third point. It stopped the war. Ended World War II. This was a very popular argument. And many of the men who fought in the South Pacific, hearing that Japan surrendered shortly after the dropping of the bombs, were extremely thankful to Truman. This argument was rarely questioned. For many years, in the late 50s, historians began to question it. The argument that we had to drop the atomic bombs in order to end World War II was given with the assumption that it was a military reason for dropping the bomb. So some historians began to look at Japan's military situation at this time. August 1945. Japan was trying to surrender. The critics, of course, would argue that Japan was not serious, and that the military would have never let the civilians surrender. They would have shot them down dead before they would lose face. Well, the civilians were trying to surrender in a way that would save face on it by keeping their Emperor Hirohito. The Japanese Marines in August of 45 were gone. Dead, missing, in the south. The Japanese army, probably as many as 5 million, were split. Half were in the Far East, particularly in China, where they've been fighting a long, drawn-out quagmire war, guerrilla war, between Chiang Kai-shek's troops on the one hand and Mao Zedong's communist guerrillas on the other. Half their armies were throughout the Far
The other half was in Japan, ill-equipped, sick. The only food source in abundance was acorns, which Emperor Hirohito told the Japanese to collect in July of 1945. The Navy, the Japanese Navy, the Japanese Merchant Marine, gone. The last destroyer sunk August 1st, 1945, and Japan lived by trade. That's why they became imperialists, because of economic dependence. All you would have to do with the Japanese is blockade their island and they would die. Just like the British. The Japanese built a big navy and became imperialists, just like the British, to protect their home islands. Blockaded by American ships, American planes, American subs, their ports mined. Japanese people undergoing an economic breakdown. Their Air Force was down to about 5,000 zeros. By this time, the planes were outdated and outmoded. They put 50-year-olds in there and strap them in, give them some sake, and have them go on kamikaze raids. Basically, we dominated the air and took off anti-aircraft guns from our B-29s because we dropped napalm on their cities. It looks to some, too, that American military leaders were divided, whether we should invade the island or not. General George Marshall, who was Truman's favorite, argued that we had to invade. We had to invade Germany to get her defeat, to surrender. We would have to invade Japan. General Eisenhower wasn't sure. In fact, he told Henry L. Stimson in Potsdam, there's no need to invade the island of Japan, that they would surrender soon. The U.S. Air Force and Navy were split on it too. General Curtis LeMay thought that Japan was on the verge of surrendering. The U.S. Air Force did a study of the Strategic Bombing Command later, which concluded that Japan probably would have surrendered as early as November, maybe as late as December 1945. It looks to some historians that the military reason for dropping the bombs probably, at the very most, could be stated this way. It quickened the surrender of an already defeated enemy. Kind of like you going in the woods and you see a grizzly bear. You take out your machine and fill it full of holes. And it's bleeding all over. And it crawls back into its cave. All you got to do is take out your little 22 and finish it off. Instead of drop 20,000 tons. Well, if it wasn't a military decision, some historians argued it must have been political. What would be the political reason for dropping the bomb? One historian, Gar Alperovitz, wrote a book in 1963 called Atomic Diplomacy. He argued we dropped the bomb in order to impress the Soviet Union, which had expanded into the Far East and into Eastern Europe by this time, to impress the Soviet Union with America's air power. And we used it. Others wrote books arguing that maybe we dropped it to justify the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project was the top secret code word for building the bombs. It cost $2 billion. At that time, unlike today, pocket change was probably $1 billion, not counting inflation. Would be probably 30 billion today. 60 billion. We built 4 cities. We used the best scientists in Britain and the United States. We spent 3 years doing it. Congress asked, what are you doing? Top secret, can't say. What if we didn't use it? say so. How do you justify the program? Maybe we could have used that money in developing jets or rockets, as the Germans would do. Now, what if they dropped it and then said that they ended the war? That'd make everybody who made him a hero. Other historians argue, you're getting too complicated with all these analysis. We dropped the bombs because we hated the bastard Japs. It was our revenge for Pearl Harbor. And there was no more. Hatred. Anger. I opened it up to questions.
In your research, did you come across any references to the fact that I believe Japan thought about making what we call a dirty bomb, radiation bomb, not atomic, but using radiation?
No, I haven't come across any of that. I think that there was some article or some talk in recent years that Japan was, I don't know, but I have not.
I was in the service in early 1945, never went overseas. And of course, after the bomb was dropped, I said, thank God I don't have to fight or anything like that. But then years later, when I read more about this subject, the first target, one of the targets was Kyoto. And they said, well, we can't drop the bomb on Kyoto. It's one of these beautiful temples. That really bothered me. You think about saving the temples and not saving other people's lives. Now, I know one of the ideas was to drop it away from the civilian population, but then they said there wasn't enough visual material to buy more than 2 bombs. So, what's your thought on that?
Well, Kyoto was saved by Henry L. Stimson. The head of the project, Lester Groves, General Lester Groves, was the head of the Manhattan Project. And he wanted to drop it in Kyoto because he thought that 1 million people would die. And it would really show the effect of the bomb because it was a flat area and whatever. And Henry L. Stimson had gone there with his wife on his honeymoon. And as you said, it was a beautiful area. It was the seat. It was the seat of Japanese culture and tradition and history, the old capital. So he convinced Truman, according to the story, not to do it at Kyoto. The idea of dropping the bomb on a deserted area was what some of the scientists wanted. After Germany surrendered in May of 1945, many of the scientists who were told, whether rightly or wrongly, some think that the government was lying to them on this, that there really wasn't any evidence that Germany was making any bombs. They were using rocket jet propulsion things. And we bombed their heavy water plant in 1943, so they weren't making any bombs. They were told that they were going to get the bomb, we had to make it real quick. When Germany surrendered, they thought, well, maybe we ought to just show the Japanese what we got. But 4 of the scientists, including Oppenheimer, one of the leading scientists, a squelch. I don't think Truman even saw that petition. But Truman never thought of it more than another weapon in our arsenal. The cabinet members around Truman never really discussed, except for Admiral William Lee, who was the chief of staff. I don't think they really discussed not using it. The repercussions for destroying Japan totally were criticized by some strategic historians as being stupid. Winston Churchill was a real politician, kind of like a Henry Kissinger. And he knew that today's enemy could be tomorrow's ally, and today's ally could be tomorrow's enemy. And that if you know anything about American foreign policy, you'll know that the strongest power in Europe and the strongest power in Asia is our traditional enemy. Well, if there were 3 major powers in 1941 in Eurasia: Germany, Soviet Union, and Japan. If you totally destroy Germany and Japan, you got 1 left. Stalin's the leader.
No sooner did we destroy Germany and Japan, as you know, than we put billions of dollars to rebuild it as a bulwark against Soviet expansionism. So some people thought that Truman and his crew were not thinking ahead. Maybe they weren't capable of it at the last 6 months. Maybe the war passions were too great. Yeah.
Did Churchill ever comment publicly on the wisdom or necessity of dropping the bomb?
Good question. I don't know the right answer. Churchill wrote, of course, one of the best histories of World War II. 6 volumes of World War II. You might check the library here and look at his final volume on the British and Japan and see what his comments are. As far as I know, I don't know. I think that whether he agreed or not, he probably wouldn't publicly say, because he wanted us still to remain very strongly allies against the Soviet expansionists.
If you're going to drop a bomb on a city and you've got instrumentation to let you know where you are, what difference does it make whether or not there's cloud cover?
Well, they weren't sure that it would land in the city, though. We didn't have instruments like today where you might have a little more pinpoint. Pinpoint bombing today is if you do. You didn't know.
And the next question is, did Truman publicly comment on any regrets?
No. He said it was the greatest thing in history. On the ship going back from Potsdam, he told the sailors, "But Captain, we dropped the bomb on Hiroshima." He hit the glass where it was drinking from. He said, "I need your attention." He says, we just dropped an atomic bomb on Hiroshima. This was one of the greatest things in history. He got mad if he brought it up. If he criticized it, he got mad.
How long after they dropped the bomb did they ever give any? I mean, people live in Hiroshima and Nagasaki now. It's not abandoned. That should never be. Has there been any long-lasting effects?
Well, the people that were exposed to black rain. Oh, by the way, when it comes to Truman, I should add that in his diary he does discuss the terrible destruction of the bomb. And I should also add that there were a couple of senators who wrote Truman afterwards that he stopped the war too quickly, that we should have dropped more bombs on Japan. I'll get to your question. It's hard to understand. And Henry L. Stimson, he wrote this big article in 1948 in Harper's Magazine, and he put forth these 3 arguments. We dropped them to avoid an invasion of Japan. We dropped them to save American lives. We dropped them to end the war. He kind of put, because there was some, I read the newspapers at that time, and there was almost no criticism of the war until we dropped the bomb. But wait, your question about black rain. See, black rain came down, and people got it, and they didn't immediately get sick. But people were dying of radiation right up until the 1950s, and it would cause birth defects and things like this. It's hard to know how many people were actually really affected. But no, American soldiers, when they landed in Japan, and I think it was late September, early October, MacArthur, I think, was the first one there. He said, "I trust the Japanese, they won't hurt you." And when he landed and everything, they went right to Hiroshima. This is where a lot of these pictures were taken, Nagasaki, Hiroshima. Apparently not, yeah.
Yeah, I was just wondering, we wanted, obviously, Russia to end the war against Japan, but clearly we were already winning the war. Clearly Russia was in the process of expanding. So how much,
That's a good question. Truman, Roosevelt was afraid. See, our war propaganda was that they're out to conquer the world. Well, their industrial might was only 10% of the United States. They couldn't conquer China. They've been dug in there in this quagmire, as we're in quagmires overseas today, and we're in Vietnam. You know, for years, since 1937, they couldn't defeat the Chinese, more or less conquer the world. Well, they must have some hidden reserves. We thought they had this big army in Manchuria, the Manchukuo Japanese army, that will need the Soviets to defeat it, and we won't have to invade China. This was the thinking, apparently. It was all myth. Whether we actually believe that or not, sometimes we believe our own propaganda. But the Russians said they would enter in late summer. They entered right away. They entered 2 or 3 days after the bombing of Hiroshima, because they wanted to get some of the loot, particularly in China. They went right through Manchuria in 6 days, right into North Korea. But it's hard, because today we see the expansion of Russia, and we say, oh, you know. But back then, they were our allies, and we were fighting the Germans and the Japanese, and we were caught up in the throes of the actions. Winston Churchill, however, he saw beyond that. He was a very strategic mind, British.
Was it Hirohito, did he remain emperor after the war?
That's right.
This was the thing. MacArthur became the chief, though. He took over all the power, but we didn't destroy the emperor. Some argue that we kept the war going so we wouldn't lose face by accepting their surrender terms. They kept the war going so they could save face. Now, you might argue that in April, when we learned of these peace feelers, which we did, we also learned it at Potsdam from Stalin, and we broke their codes, we were reading them, that we could have, or Truman could have gone on the radio in April of 45 and said this. I know this is a decision that will be criticized, but I'm going to accept the Japanese terms of surrender in order to avoid invading the home islands, save American lives, and end World War II. He would have saved the world. And it would have been smarter to leave Japan intact. Maybe save us some money from rebuilding it. Easy to see in hindsight. Yeah.
How many bombs did we have then?
Another one would have been ready, I think, August 12th. I think the third target was they were going to drop it on Tokyo. I don't know. There wasn't much left of Tokyo.
And I assume that the overall response of the public in this country following dropping the bombs was positive, supportive?
Yes. Yes, I mean, peace. I mean, 4 years of war and all this. Now we got peace, and a lot of, you know, there was 11, 12 million men and many women, too, who had joined the services. Hundreds of thousands of women were in the services. And, of course, many of our women were in near combat areas, nurses and things, who were, hey, my life, I can live my life. And they wanted the war to end. We dropped the bombs to end the war. This became the mantra. And this became passed down from parents to children and children to their children. And it becomes part of our heritage. Yeah.
I missed a lot what you said when you lowered your voice, but I do recall you said that the Americans hated the Japanese. As a whole, that could be true. But we carried Japanese prisoners which were taken, I think, from Saipan aboard our ship. And we treated them as humanly as possible as we'd treat our own people. We had no resentment towards them. We delivered them someplace, and they were placed into prisoner of war camp. Also, during the war, the Kamikaze, there was a Kamikaze plane with 3 Japanese. And they were shot out of the sky either by the Callahan or by one of the battleships, which they, of course, were trying to attack. When the plane hit the water, it struck wing and it sort of tumbled over and threw out two of the occupants. The captain of the Callahan, who believed in those in peril of sea, picked these two men up. One died soon. The other one, of course, was treated aboard the Callahan by a pharmacist mate, then transferred to one of the battleships, could have been to New Mexico, maybe to West Virginia, and ended up in a prisoner of war camp. He later became president of a paper company in Japan, and in 1995, to make a long story short, he attended the reunion of the sailors of the USS Callahan and gave them thanks for their saving his life. Now, I noticed, I think the Americans, the soldiers, the Marines, and the sailors were very humane in their attitude toward the Japanese, because I was there and experienced it. You failed to mention what the Japanese had, and I experienced one of the main weapons they had, the Kamikaze. It hit my ship, and we had 38 casualties, killing 9, the day before the invasion of Okinawa. Now, the Japanese had suicide planes, the Kamikaze, suicide rockets, they had suicide torpedoes, submarines, suicide motorboats, suicide frogmen, and they were training millions of the populace for suicidal attacks for the invaders of the homeland, should the invasion come. We would have lost, I would say at least, they say an estimated 500,000. I think it'd be more to a million. Many of our troops would never have gotten off the ships, the transport ships that they were on. They would have sunk those ships by either frogmen, the suicide motorboats, and we would have been in a terrible mess. And as an afterthought, I understand that the invasion, which was due for the last of October, 1st of November, would never have come about had we not dropped the bombs. It was planned for that time. A horrendous typhoon, which was miscalculated in its direction, wiped out hundreds of ships in Buckner Bay and Okinawa. It killed personnel. It blew away Quonset huts, all the supplies, and had our invasion forces, many 150,000 men been in tents and whatever on the island of Okinawa, they would have been destroyed. And they would have set the invasion back, as estimated, at least a year or 2 years. So my ship carried the atomic bomb, little boy, and dropped it off at the island of Tinian for Enola Gay to deliver in Hiroshima.
Indianapolis?
The Indianapolis. And of course it was later sunk, and nearly, there was 880 men died of the crew, and only 317 survived. To this day, I am thankful that they dropped the atomic bomb, both of them. Because had we had to invade, we would have lost mucho Americans. And I'm in favor of killing Japanese or dying versus Americans. And the other thing, I don't think that the Japanese innocent civilians, these civilians were part of the operation to provide all these suicidal provisions, the submarines, the torpedoes, the airplanes, the rockets, the motorboats, whatever they had for suicidal attacks, including the populace who were being trained. they are just as responsible as the Japanese soldier out there with a gun. So that's my opinion, and I thank God to this day for the atomic bomb. Thank you for your time.
I think you very articulately stated what Truman and Stimson argued. We treat POWs good. And the reason for that, and Colin Powell didn't like the idea of Guantanamo. As a soldier, you treat the enemy soldiers good because you want them to treat our soldiers good. They're kind of like hostages. You're nice to our guys, we're nice to your guys. You're not nice to our guys, we're not going to be nice to your guys. I'm not so sure that that's an expression of kindness to the Japanese as it was an expression of self-interest. I think that when soldiers are in battle, you probably have two things. Correct me if I'm wrong. One is you dehumanize the enemy so you can kill him. The other thing is you often meet the enemy in ways that you see that he's human. And that may offset some of the propaganda that you get from the government. In World War I, they had Christmas truce the first year. And the French and the British got out of the trenches, and the Germans got out of the trenches, and they met each other in the middle of no man's land. And after that, they had to rotate these soldiers because they couldn't kill as easily anymore. The hatred of the Japanese, though, from reading the things that coming out of the United States at the time, the newspapers and everything, slap the Japs. They're apes. It was against the Nazis, too. But it looks to me like our war with Japan, in terms of our propaganda, is the same kind of war that the Germans waged against the Soviet Union. And I'll state it looked to me like it was a war of extermination and racism. If you want to argue that we had to invade Japan, okay. But it looks to me like the military was split on this. And the Air Force and the Strategic Bombing Circuit saw that Japan wasn't going anywhere. All you got to do is just keep that blockade on. You're going to surrender. Or die. Yeah.
During the 3-year development of the Manhattan Project, was there ever any suggestion or discussion that this bomb that was being invented and produced would have to be used on Germany?
Oh, yes. The scientists hoped it would, some of them. They hated the Germans. And many of the scientists were refugees, some of them, I believe there was a few Jews there too, Jewish. They hated the Nazis, They didn't see it as dropping on Japan. Many of them. They saw it dropping it on the Germans. And the government, according later to some of them, were telling them fibs that, well, the Germans they almost got it, hurry up, guys. And in fact, Albert Einstein wrote a letter to Roosevelt in 1939. There was a couple of German scientists who apparently were trying to get Hitler to emphasize atomic rather than rockets. And he wrote a letter to Roosevelt saying, we better start developing the atomic bomb, and then Roosevelt started the project in 1942. Later, Einstein said he regretted this. But the scientists were split after Germany surrendered. And as mentioned here, some of them wanted to drop it on an island. Others wanted to let them know what we had. On the other hand, it looked to me like we could have negotiated with the Japanese. We didn't have to continue the war.
Were the Japanese convinced enough that they were losing the war against us that they didn't see fit to send some of their troops to China and burn them into the Pacific Theater and Japan itself? Did they consider that front in China more important at that point?
They always considered the China front important. This is why they attacked us, because we stopped their oil. We told them to get the hell out of China. We gave them an ultimatum. You know, you get out of China, you get out of Manchuria, you get out of Vietnam. They've been in those three areas by 1940, 41. You get out of there, and we'll turn back on the oil. But we didn't meet them in Hawaii. Prime Minister Kanoe wanted to meet Roosevelt in Hawaii in August of 1941. And we didn't do that unless they agreed to get out of the Far East. They were stuck. How do you get out of this war and save face? The military would never accept, you know, they never accept we're losing. But the civilians, you know, we got to get out of this problem. The emperor realized after the bombing of Tokyo in April of 1945, and by the way, we killed more people in that bombing than we killed in Hiroshima. According to the U.S. Army, over 110,000 Japanese died in the bombing, in the napalm bombing of Tokyo in April 11th and 12th of 1945. But here again, we killed more Japanese in the fire bombings than we killed in the atomic bombs. Truman one time said, you know, why are you criticizing Hiroshima? Why don't you criticize Tokyo?
Speaking of our great fear that the Germans might beat us to the atomic bomb, there's a story that may be apocryphal. You go to CIA headquarters, you'll see in their museum a write of this. There was a catcher for the Detroit Tigers named Mo Burke, who could speak 7 languages but couldn't hit many of his head. He went to Germany, this is pre-Pearl Harbor, to find out that Heisenberg was involved with the atomic bomb. And he spoke German. He took the gun with him. And it turned out that Heisenberg was helping to build, had any success in doing this, was to kill him. And it turned out that he got the idea that they weren't getting anywhere with that, so we never had to shoot him. That's a true story. That's fantastic. Have you heard that?
No, I haven't heard that one. I haven't heard that.
One question. First of all, I want to compliment you on your presentation. 2, I want to criticize your presentation. 3, don't shoot the messenger. And history is always 2020. Regarding General MacArthur, where was he in this decision-making process where we were trying to decide whether or not and how frequently we had to drop the bomb?
He wasn't.
Why?
He felt he was being slighted.
His ego is as big as this room as it is in now.
Well, he felt that, again, he wanted the emphasis to be on defeating Japan, not defeating Germany. But Roosevelt, from the beginning, put the emphasis, as you know, on defeating Germany. And this kicked MacArthur. MacArthur and Eisenhower always had this tension, you know, that he's being neglected. MacArthur is being neglected. And we probably could have defeated the Japanese earlier if we put most of our emphasis in the Far East. They really were stuck. They were stuck in the Far East. They really were stuck.
What was MacArthur's thinking with respect to the dropping the bomb?
I wasn't able to get his thinking particularly. Some people in his headquarters, Colonel Kramer, for instance, and of course the U.S. Army Air Force under General Curtis LeMay, they did not think that it was necessary to defeat Japan. They argued the way to defeat Japan was to bomb their cities. We didn't have to invade. This began the bombing campaign in April of 1945. Operation Meeting House, General Curtis LeMay called it.
Have there been any subsequent studies done to bomb cities as far as residual radiation is concerned? For example, hear about Chernobyl and people couldn't return there. Were those bombs not sufficiently powerful radiation-wise to have enough residual radiation so that people have returned there? Or what happened with...
Well, they got sick. A lot of them got sick. You know, we dropped this bomb, I think it was Trinity. It was called Trinity. It was an island after the war.
And we put a bunch of sailors about 3 miles from this island. And we wanted to see the effects of this bomb on our sailors. And by the way, and there's a documentary on this. I mean, the Army took pictures of this. It's a documentary film. And they had a radiation gun. And after they dropped the bomb, they put it on the guys. And I mean, it was just off the wall. And a lot of these guys got sick.
But I guess I was thinking in terms of subsequent generations that hadn't had that exposure directly, or even the deformed generations that produced immediate narrative later on, decades later.
I don't know. That would be a good study. I do know that those who got black rain that came down from the sky like burnt paper, and it was radiation. They do like this to get it off. But a lot of them did die later from it. There's a good movie called Black Rain that talks about it.
It would seem, just looking at genetics, that people who were affected by this, and you might not really have recognized their symptoms as being the radiation sickness, that this would be perpetuated even today as each generation goes on, that this is somehow carried in their body and affecting their DNA.
Probably. There's a lot of areas here to be studied. These were small bombs compared to what we have today.
I mean, even today, our government doesn't seem to want to acknowledge that the fact that people who served, say, in the Gulf War come back and have children that have all sorts of deformities and problems, and their older children conceived before they went to war were perfectly fine, and our government doesn't seem to see much correlation between that service and those problems that the subsequent generations have felt.
Well, they did with the Korean War. Some of you guys may have remembered that some of the guys were in training in the Mexican deserts, and they were dropping these small yield atomic bombs about 2 miles from them. They were in the trenches there, and they weren't supposed to breathe in, right? And then it shows, you can see documentary footage. They wanted to get used to an A-bomb so they wouldn't be afraid of it.
Yeah.
And so they got up, and you could see all this dirt and everything going, getting in your ears and your nose. And some of these guys later sued them, and they got cancer.
Well, and there haven't been stories of people who, their families who lived in those areas would go and watch these things, sort of like going to the drive-in in the summer, and then years and years later, those people and their children are suddenly coming down with sort of bizarre cancers and things.
If there's studies like this I'm not aware of, and there probably is, you could look on the internet.
Yeah, were the scientists cognizant of the potential effects of radiation on the people?
I believe the scientists were practicing denial. Some of the scientists, they were cognizant there was going to be radiation. They thought if they dropped it in the air, if they blew it up in the air, because the bomb blew up a mile in the air from Hiroshima's ground, blew up in the mile, and somehow they felt that this would lessen the radiation. But what goes up comes down.
Because they understood the effects of radiation.
I'm not sure how well they did.
I'm not either.
And I don't think they did either. This was all experimental. When they dropped a test bomb in the New Mexican desert, they did calculations where this blast might destroy the Earth. They figured there was a 2% chance it was worth it.
They didn't really describe the molecular structure of the genetic effects of DNA until the 50s. They probably didn't have a clear understanding of the genetic implications.
They were experimenting with this bomb, with making this bomb, in a basement underneath the football field at the University of Chicago.
So that chain reaction.
Yeah, the chain reaction. There goes Chicago.
A couple of things. One of them is, I think a couple of men died from that experiment in Chicago when they produced a lot of radiation, and I think one was, I can't remember his name. But the other thing, you mentioned about the Japanese, I think they were very brutal soldiers. I read the Bataan Death March, and then I know somebody whose father was an officer and a prisoner of war in Japan who was constantly beaten by the Japanese. They were brutal, and they thought it was a disgrace for anybody, for them to surrender or anybody else to surrender. I saw the Japanese American prisoners of war who had been in Japan in the hospital when I was in the hospital in Guam, and they looked like skeletons. They were starved practically to death. And one other point you brought up about the napalm bombing. Had we not dropped the bomb, that would have continued all over Japan. It would not only been, I think, 100-some thousand killed one night from fire bombs, but probably 1 million killed from fire bombs, and the war continued. And which is worse, to be burned to death or to be blown to death by the A bomb or by subsequent radiation, killed by radiation, by cancer or whatever occurs. And with that, I'm going to have to leave because I have a 1:30 appointment. Thank you very much.
Appreciate your comments. And you were on the Indianapolis, you were very brave.
I got to get out of here.
These guys were in the ocean, and there were sharks, am I right? There were sharks all around you guys when you were in the ocean.
Yes.
And I think most of you didn't even survive.
We had about 300 men get down with the ship, entombed in the ship, some dead, some alive, couldn't escape. And we figured somewhere around 900 in the water. We spent 5 days, some grass, some cargo nets, mostly life jackets. And we spent nearly 5 days in the ocean, no food, no water, very little sleep. You can't sleep in a life jacket. And at the end, another 600 died in the water, or some suicides, but most of them have died. Some were killed by shark, some were killed by other sailors who craved for thirst. And one case, a sailor slit the throat of another sailor to drink his blood. So I didn't see it, but 3 other survivors did.
Were you in the water? Were you in the water?
Life jacket.
Is that right?
Yeah. It was no fun. I wouldn't want to do it again.
I would like to pose a hypothetical. If the Japanese had the technology with a bomb, my personal opinion is I think they would have used it in an instant.
You're probably
without
right.
mercy.
I think that any nation, when they're at war in these wars, use basically everything they got. Gas was used in World Wars I. Of course, the Germans used gas in World War II to kill civilians. We dropped napalm. We created firestorms, food blockades. I mean, when it comes to barbarity, war is barbaric. It hasn't really gone that far since the old days when, you know, it was out to destroy the entire civilization. And I think part of the reason that our hands were restrained in the Korean War, possibly in the Vietnam War, is because the other side had atomic bombs too. So we've got a lot of education to do, hopefully, to prevent World War III, which our nation probably will not survive. All right. Sean, thank you again. I'm willing to come back anytime, talk about this stuff or anything else. You're a very great audience, and I'm truly glad that you came and